Okay, welcome back to Human Nature Online. Here we go. I should have gotten all my postings already, the welcome back letter, etc. Hopefully that answers all of your questions and so forth. I'm going to talk about Epicurus today, who is different than Epictetus. That's important. There's two major schools of philosophy in the Hellenistic world. Uh, that is the Stoics first, and secondly the Epicureans. And the Epicureans fought with the Stoics all the time. They had very contrasting views about the best life for the human being. Uh, so Epicurus is born 70 years after Plato on the island of Samos. He is famous as a student for asking physics questions, especially about the nature of causality and the whole problem of change. Um, and he was very unhappy with all the schools of thought that he came up against, and so he started his own school at a very young age, and then later went to Athens and set up there. Um, the number one thing about Epicurus that's different than all of the other philosophers so far is he is not concerned about the rationalism of human beings. Um, he's essentially an atheist, not an atheist in that he directly denies the existence of God, but atheistic in the sense that there's a total absence of discussion about natural order, about God, etc., and that is because he had these fundamental concerns about causality. He thought that there was chaos in the universe. If there is chaos in the universe, then the so-called archetypes and things that we find in Plato and these other ideas he thought were undermined by the whole problem of disorder within the universe. Nobody else has this. The Stoics believe in God, in natural order. Aristotle believes in God, natural order. Plato, God, natural order. And they all follow out of the Socratic questions and so forth. Epicurus is not a Socratic philosopher. He's the first philosopher we've had so far who's not concerned with the Socratic type of questioning about what is virtue. Virtue is some kind of excellence. How do we get there, and so forth. Um, and in spite of all that, he still does have an answer to the two fundamental questions: what is the self? What is the best way to care for the self? And he does have a notion of a techne for the self. Um, but he's not a Socratic philosopher. You never find him referring to Plato, Aristotle, or any of these other people. He's very famous for being an independent thinker. He famously said that he learned from no one, um, and the only person he seems to have influence on him was the pre-Socratic Democritus, who was a materialist. He was the famous philosopher, right, who said that atoms are the fundamental constituent of the universe. And so Epicurus stays with that notion, a materialistic universe, a universe which is ruled not only by the physics that have law to them, but also unlawful kinds of physics. That is chaos theory in contemporary terms. Um, uh, and so for this reason, he really thinks about human nature in a different way. Um, the rational picture of human beings as having the ability of analysis and so forth is kind of an outcropping of our ability biologically. It's nothing given to us divine, um, and so forth. Um, so, um, the fundamental thing about Epicurus' notion of who we are as human beings and the fundamental question answered about the self is that essentially we are biological beings, and out of that, beings of sensation only. And that's why ultimately Epicurus is going to be a hedonist. His answer to the best life for the human being is pleasure, um, but not in the typical hedonist version of it. But the best life for a human being as pleasure is simply that because we are biological beings of sensation, and naturally, all beings of sensation move away from that which causes pain and Epicurus thinks moves towards that which has a positive sensation. But of course, he's going to see that there's problems with different kinds of sensation that appear pleasurable on the surface, but ultimately he thinks are not. Um, so there's no need for rational analysis in Epicurus beyond the ability for a biological being to think carefully about whether something in their life is going to cause them pain or whether it's going to ultimately lead to pleasure. So these are the fundamental constituents. And the Stoics argued heavily with the Epicureans about this because their idea was that life should be growth and strength and power, and in order to grow we have to often suffer. And the Stoics would have been very much okay with extreme sports if they thought there was glory or that you might grow or build in character by doing something like that. um, you know uh, they would be okay with it, whereas Epicurus would be like, no, you naturally should take care of yourself. Care of the self for Epicurus is uh, shy away from things that are going to cause you biological degradation, whether that's sickness, whether that's falling out of a tree because you wanted to climb it and then you hurt yourself, um, any of those kind of things. Um, so he's very different than the Stoics, and he's very different than the Cynics. He's different than Plato and so forth. Um, so Epicurus is a hedonist. He says the best life for the human being is pleasure, but he's not happy about the unsophisticated view that other hedonists have about pleasure. Most hedonists think that pleasure means, eat, drink, and be merry, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Epicurus does not have that view at all. Um, and it's in part deriving from his definition of pleasure. You'll note that his definition of pleasure is not the kind that you find in the dictionary. His definition of pleasure is literally the absence of pain. Pleasure is an absence, so it's a negative state. It's not something that you go and get, it's not something positive. It's the state in which there's nothing detrimental occurring to a biological system. And so um, this makes him very different than other Epicureans, or sorry, other hedonists, because the pleasure incentive is not like a drug, like you take something and you try to get higher than you already are. The pleasure incentive for Epicurus is to essentially stay at a place of equanimity, equilibrium. Like the Stoics, he sort of saw that there was this wave principle that, if you go high, eventually you have to go low. And so he didn't want to encourage the kind of pleasures which actually ultimately lead to more detriment. And so he thought that that was his main concern against other hedonists, is that they were unsophisticated hedonists. They thought that the way you got pleasure was by adding something to your existence already. For him, that is not what pleasure is. Pleasure is the overall state of positive sensation or feeling within the body. Especially Epicurus puts a lot of emphasis on the body. He does put some emphasis on the mind, but the emphasis on the mind is either social. He says that good conversation is a good part of human life, or poetry, things like that. He's not big into, say, mathematics or something like that per se, like Plato was. Feats of the mind that are science, math, and things like that. But he thought that we were social beings and we were intellectual beings, and those pleasures were good and non-harmful. But he's not like Aristotle or Plato or anyone like that, where he thinks that the excellence of the human being is to maximize rational thought. what he wants us to do to live well is to basically avoid pain. Avoid pain at whatever cost and live as long as you can. And that is the pleasurable life. And that's the good life. And that's something that just naturally follows, he thinks, out of being a biological being. If you take a dog or a cat or some other animal and you say take a red hot poker out of the fire and you put it near to them, they'll naturally back away from it. And in similar order, that's what human beings are. We should do that too. It's very normal for us to move away from things that cause us pain. And it's fairly normal for us to reach out towards things that replenish us in a good sense, like you're thirsty and you drink, clean, clear water. You're hungry and you eat an apple. Again, an animal will do these kinds of things. Our problem is that we become unsophisticated hedonists because what we do often is we pick things that we think are pleasurable, but in the long run actually end up more pain. So there's a sort of calculus of pleasure and pain, and the problem is that people confuse. They're unsophisticated about what pleasure is. The common person thinks that they should have sugar, or they should have caffeine, or they should do a drug or have sex or something like that, and then they add something, and then their life is good. But Epicurus thinks, no, what happens is all those kind of things in the long run will give you more pain than pleasure. And if you want your life to have more pleasure than pain, then you have to be very careful about analyzing whatever pleasures you're going to participate in, because many are the opposite of what they appear. They appear that they will add something and make your life more pleasurable, but actually the amount of pain that they'll give you in the long run is going to be greater. And again, probably the most common case of this would be drugs, right? Somebody takes drugs, they feel good for a few years or whatever, but ultimately they're subtracting from their body, their biochemicals, their brain chemistry and so forth is being altered, and later they're going to pay for it in a really bad way. And the amount of pain that they're going to get is far exceeding to whatever pleasure they got from it. And Epicurus doesn't talk much, about drugs. He'll talk about wine. He likes to talk about food. You'll see that he's very much against fish with fancy sauces, which is a funny case of it. But anyway, luxurious foods that taste good for the 10 minutes or 5 minutes that you eat them, but ultimately are deleterious to the body, and then ultimately later you get some actual ailment. So he has a technique. He has a distinction of three kinds of pleasures. The first is the natural and the necessary. Those are pleasures that are both natural to us, and we need them, and those are good. Those are the ones that we should constantly indulge in. And those things are very simple. Things like healthy food. He was a huge dietetics freak. Exercise. He thought it was natural for us and necessary as gregarious or social animals to talk to people, have relationships with people, and it's good. It's good to sit around a campfire and talk and just enjoy that. Those things are all good pleasures, and they're not going to lead to anything that has a kind of hangover to it. The second one is the natural but not necessary, and maybe I'll come back to that one. That's the funniest one of all. So there's the natural and the necessary, the natural but not necessary, and then there's the unnatural and the unnecessary. And this is the kind that he thinks the unsophisticated hedonist gets caught up in all the time, which is that they pick something that appears pleasurable but ultimately is destroying the body, the mind, mostly the body. That's what Epicurus is most interested in, really. Like a great example of that in today's term would be like, Mountain Dew or something like that. It's sugary, it gives you a quick bump up, you taste good, whatever. But ultimately, it's going to end up giving you diabetes if you keep drinking it all the time. It's habit forming, etc. But even something that maybe isn't quite as habit forming, you could think of, some sort of, caramel candy or something like that. Most people are like, what does it matter if I have a little bit of caramel candy? Um, mm, I think especially in Epicurus's era, it would make more sense that that's a huge problem. You have a little caramel candy, you have it every once in a while, you think it's no big deal, uh, but you live in an era without dentistry, and so eventually you get a cavity. In Epicurus's era, they didn't just go in there and they could make a little nice drill and clean that all up and then put a filling in. You'd have to get the whole tooth pulled, and it would be excruciatingly painful without any anesthesia. And that's the point in which you would realize that the pain far exceeded whatever tiny little bit of enjoyment you got from some food that was unnecessary. Um, and again, some of this kind of makes sense in the era in which medicine is not as good. But again, I could go back to Mountain Dew and type 2 diabetes. You might drink Mountain Dew and, do that for many, many years or something. And if it seems fine, but it's, depleting your adrenal system with caffeine, and it's throwing off your insulin levels from the sugar. And at some point, you get type 2 diabetes. Well, if you know anything about that, that's going to be a miserable experience for a long time, and it could end with very bad things like losing a foot or being in dialysis all the time or something like that. Um, and so even today, we have a lot of the similar problems, but those would have been maximized in his era because medicine, of course, was not as advanced. So you have the natural and necessary, the unnatural and the unnecessary. Those are, that's the drugs and the fancy fish dishes with the excessive sauces on it that he talks about. And then the second one, which is very funny, is that this is mostly really just referring to sex. He thought that sex was natural, and that you have to have procreation for the species. It's part of human and animal life. But he thought that it was unnecessary, at least for a sophisticated hedonist, because his belief was is that sex, not in the actual act, but in the overall course of complex human relationships, usually ended with more pain than pleasure. And you may have some sense of this. The people get together and then they have a relationship, and then the relationship goes bad, and then they break up, and then they're miserable, and they go to therapy and so forth. So this would be a case of it. People think that the sex or the sex relationship will be pleasurable, but ultimately it leads to years of therapy bill and bad breakups and painful relationships and so forth. And so Epicurus actually encouraged, which was again is funny because he's a hedonist, that his disciples not engage in sex, because he actually believed that it wasn't a good bet, that overall certain pleasures in the end lead to more pain. And now I would remind you that he's living in a world where marriages were very unbalanced. The average marriage was like a 30-year-old to a 13-year-old girl. Uh, the age difference, the education difference, the very social format, dominance, control, of course, made for bad relationships and marriages and other relationships as well. And so Epicurus is pretty cynical about relationships. And it's fairly sad. I mean, until you get to the Christian world, marriage is not exonerated as something really beautiful or having any divine sense to it. It's very utilitarian. People married for social prestige, inheritance, dowries, things like that. And generally, the men were very authoritative over the women, and people had bad relationships. And so Epicurus's view about relationships and sex in general derives from that era, I think. But again, it is an important point to note, because most people who are hedonists think that pleasurable life is sex, drugs, rock and roll. Well, Epicurus would have probably been against the the rock and roll, because you blow out your eardrums, and certainly he would have been against the drugs, and he's also emphatically against the sex. So it's sort of funny to think about hedonists that were mostly celibate, but that was actually what he recommended to his followers. Um, uh, so Epicurus thinks that for the best life, what we need is the most pleasure. Again, pleasure equals the absence of pain. So basically, to have a good life means to avoid pain as much as possible. And that is that kind of equilibrium that gives for satisfying existence. And we use our cognitive abilities to consider very carefully our pleasures, pick the ones that are a good bet, shy away from the ones that are a long term bad bet, and that gives us the overall good life. Now, Epicurus is aware that there's other things that human beings um, are concerned about that cause pain, and some of those are mentalistic. And so, one of the factors that he talks about is death, for example. He famously said, "Death is nothing to us." Why does he say that? Obviously, human beings care a great deal about the extinction of their existence. Many people spend their whole life being afraid of death. Um, Epicurus saw his philosophy as being a kind of answer to this problem, um, uh, which is mentalistic. Not every animal, right, that's biological and is concerned about sensation is afraid of death or considers death for years and years before they actually die, but we do. Um, and so his answer for this was largely that if we were a biological animal, then the biological animal as sensation um, should realize that when that sensation ceases, being that that's what we are, there's literally nothing. So death is nothing to us because it's defined as no thing. That is, if you have no sensation, you have no existence for Epicurus. That's the definition for the human animal. Sensation. Uh, Registered sensation makes for the consciousness of the human being. Since for Epicurus we don't have a soul that's immortal, like with Plato, and fundamentally we're sensation, and death by definition is the absence of sensation, and so death is just no thing. If it's no thing, then it's very much like Socrates' first definition about death, that people think it's just, the absence of consciousness. And in this case, the absence of sensation, which makes for consciousness. Um, and therefore, it's nothing ultimately to be concerned about. And that links to the second problem, which is that people are concerned about the gods and whether or not the gods punish people after death and so forth. Epicurus thinks that the gods are also not something we should be concerned with, and his answer is more vague about this. But he has a kind of strange physics example, which states basically that the human world and higher worlds don't overlap, which probably is not very convincing to anyone anymore, but at the time apparently had some weight. Um, and then further, if the gods are the sort of sophisticated beings, etc., why would they even bother with you know human animals, which are so below them or whatever? Why would they play with us or torture us or things like that? The pictures that are given in Homer and other early Greek poets. Anyway, he doesn't spend a great deal of time with it, and we don't have a lot of documents. A lot of stuff from Epicurus didn't survive, but apparently he had some sort of interesting long arguments for why this was the case. But anyway, if the definition of death stands anyway, as long as we are a sensation animal and then death is the absence of sensation, then what could the gods do to us after death? Because we have no sensation. If we have no sensation for Epicurus, we have no consciousness. If we have no consciousness, what exactly can the gods do to us? How can there be an afterlife if we have no sensation to go on? If we don't have a body, how can we have sensation? If the afterlife is defined by a bodiless state, how can we have sensation? How can we have consciousness? For Epicurus, we can't, and therefore neither of those things should concern us, neither death, nor the gods, nor the afterlife. Um, None of those things ultimately affect what we are. All that matters is why we live, why we have sensation, um, that we concern ourselves with the weight and measure of good versus bad sensation, and try to steer towards sensations that are helpful and healthy, and steer away from sensations that might appear appeasing on the surface, but ultimately in the end are very painful. Um, let's see. So Epicurus is, in terms of philosophers, he's not like Plato. There's not a huge gradation of different problems to discuss and questions about the self and so forth. And it's fairly simple, which is sort of nice and easy. We are biological matter with sensation. Consciousness derives from those two things. Um, Once that is affected, there's no more sensation, there's no more consciousness. We're just literally nothing. And that means there's no pain. That's good. If there's nothing, there can be no pain because there's no sensation. So you can't have either pleasure or pain. Um, so out of this, the basic techniques for how to live well are to evaluate pleasures, um, and then avoid those which are ultimately painful and so forth. Um, Epicurus himself, he got a piece of land that was called the garden, and he advocated people living in his garden or setting up their own gardens. It was a very simple life, of simple pleasures, foods that are uh, healthy, people who are like-minded. He completely stayed out of politics and so forth because he thought it would give you more pain in the end than pleasure, which seems correct. Um, he's often criticized for this because the idea is like, well, how do you, maintain this garden and so forth if you don't have people protecting you and so forth. But anyway, he felt that intelligent hedonists should opt out of things which cause you havoc and misery, and live a very quiet and simple life, and that will be the best life that you could ask for. Um, he's not like the cynics in that he didn't really, he doesn't really have a political agenda. I mean, he seems very apolitical, in fact. I think he just thought that there would always be some place for people to get away and live quietly. Um, the Cynics always despised the Epicureans because the Epicureans were okay with having uh, slaves essentially run things for them, do the hard labor so they didn't have to do hard labor. And of course, the Cynics were radically against slavery. So even though they might have agreed with some of the simple life notions of the Epicureans, that was a major bar between them. And the Cynics were all about glory and uh, pain, if necessary, for that kind of excellence. And so, of course, they just felt like that the Epicureans were um, trying to avoid struggle, and glory in life and joy comes from facing struggle and not trying to hide from it. Or at least, that's the way they viewed it. I don't know if we would call that fair or whatever. Um, but this is Epicurus's view, is that we should find a quiet refuge from the world with like-minded people who are sophisticated and not unsophisticated friends, and enjoy. He said there's three basic goods, very simple things: good food, meaning healthy, uh, good dwelling or shelter, and then he says good conversation, which is sort of his intellectual answer to things, which is we enjoy being with people who are fun to talk to, and we can recite poetry and things like that, and do those kinds of things. And they are pleasurable to us, and they don't cost anything, and they don't cause us pain in the end, and so forth. And so they're all natural and necessary, and therefore should be part of the human life. Um, and so, interestingly, his school became the most popular school second to the Stoics in the Hellenist era, Um, and apparently his disciples degraded a little bit from his original teaching, but the idea still remained the same, that pleasure was the absence of pain, and that we should avoid pain as we go through life. And that's common sense in logic in Epicurean terms, and it's common sense in biological terms. Like I said, an animal will just naturally move away from something which they sense as pain causing. And so that's what we should do. We should move away from things that cause pain. Um, the Stoics, again, did not like this view because they felt like it oversimplified the human being and the human being's greatness, because we basically just got reduced to being a somewhat more sophisticated animal than a lion or a tiger or a bear. There's nothing beyond that, and that's pretty much fundamental to Epicurus. We're not like Plotinus or the Christian philosophers that come next. Um, Beings who can communicate with God. There's no divine sense of communion there. Um, we're not beings who can understand the natural form of the universe, like, say, in Plato and Aristotle. In fact, the universe is filled with chaos, and there's nothing we can do about chaos. Um, well, we do our best to avoid things that are chaotic in the sense of that they may bring us ill sensation or pain, but not in the ultimate sense of the universe or physics or whatever. Um, but it makes it fundamentally different because there's just no sense of the Socratic in Epicurus. There's no sense of the divine. There's no sense of the sanctity of reason. There's no sense of natural order in the universe, like you see, especially after reading Epictetus. There's no sense of that we should be, courageous, death-defying people like Diogenes or something like that. Not at all. We were born to play it safe, and we were born to um, avoid things which are harmful to us biologically, and eventually we die, but that's okay. We'll just be nothing. Um, uh, and he also has this very interesting argument. Let's see, I put it in the sheet here about. Um, uh, he says that infinite time contains no greater pleasure than limited time. This is a really interesting concept. So he also tries to comfort us about death in that his notion is that if you had more time does not mean more pleasure. And I would ask you to think about this for a while. It's a very, very interesting philosophical notion. Um, the question is more more? Um, and this also fit with his whole notion about pleasures in general. Like, we're often unsophisticated about pleasures. So not only should we avoid, like caramel candy and Mountain Dew, but, we often think that even things that are natural and necessary, like take a peach in the summer. I mean, is anything as good as a peach, in summer? It's unbelievably good. And for Epicurus, that'd be fine. It's natural, it's necessary, it's good for the body, it's got good nutrition, it's not going to cause you a bunch of harm. You rinse out your mouth maybe afterwards from the little bit of sugar you get from the peach maybe, but that's going to be fine. It's natural, it's necessary. But often we think that more is more pleasure. Um, so I would put it this way: is the first bite of a peach less pleasurable than the 164th bite of a peach? So this is Epicurus's notion, right? We tend to think that one gumball is good, 10 gumballs must be better, or one bowl of peaches is good, 10 bowls of peaches must be better. But his notion is, if you really think about it, the interesting thing is that often we actually find the first few bites of a peach or a strawberry to be the most enjoyable. And then afterwards, actually, the more you repeat it, the less sensation has the ability to register the same height of sensation. And Epicurus is very happy about this when it comes to pain, too, because pain has a ceiling. Um, there's no such a thing as infinite pain. Your body can only register a certain amount of pain before you either die or pass out or something like that. And so his comfort about pleasure and pain, and why in some ways it's actually, a simple thing in life, it's not hard to understand and you can be happy out of it, is that really bad pain usually means you'll die quickly, and low pain may endure longer, but it's not as hard to deal with because it's a dull kind of slow pain. Um, but anyway, I mean, people who say tortured people, they've really realized that you can't just keep pain up. You need to like actually make spaces between the pain in order for the body to register the pain, because after a while, it essentially becomes like blurred. So it's sort of an interesting notion that he thought about how we register pain, how we register pleasure. But the fundamental problem is that we think that if we have more of something, it'll be more pleasurable. And he says, think about that. That's not actually the case at all. And so you don't have to buy a bushel of peaches. You can just buy, like one peach and really enjoy, that peach like crazy and be happy and enjoy that pleasure. And it'll give you something nutritious. Um, More is not going to necessarily be more. It's more about the way that sensation becomes registered. And so, in this bigger argument about infinite and finite time, and again, this is very interesting to think about, and I'd have you think about it and come up with your own sort of answer to whether you agree with Epicurus or not. But it's a more sophisticated argument than it seems. He says, if you have more time, does that necessarily mean that you'll have more pleasure? And again, this is kind of interesting because often if you talk to old people, um, what they do is they go back and relive like their younger years, of their teens or 20s, and they tell stories about that time, and they sort of revel in those memories and so forth. Um, and so there's a sort of sense, I think, that Epicurus feels like, um, would our life be better if, is 100 years worse than 1,000 years? Most people just want to say, well, to live 1,000 years has to be better. But Epicurus wants to say, well, think about that. Is that true? There's certainly a lot of people who achieve many things that give them joy and pleasure. Maybe in their young years they don't live to be, old, um, but they actually feel like they live a pretty fulfilled life. And so there's a question about maybe what defines for us our sense of the pleasure of life, um, especially since Epicurus says that as we get older, often our faculties and our body debilitates. So there's anyway, it's kind of an interesting question, fairly counterintuitive since most everybody thinks that it would definitely be nice to live 1,000 years and not 100 years. Um, but I think the factor of pain and pleasure is important, because if I said you could live for 1,000 years, but the caveat would be that, for the last 900 years, you'd have constant, stomach pain or something like that, you might say, well, I don't think that's worth it. Of course, we'd want to live 1,000 years and have pleasure the whole time. And Epicurus is not arguing with that, but his whole notion is interesting about. It's an interesting question about both the quanta of time and the quanta of pleasure, especially considering the argument I gave you about the first bite of a peach or the 164th bite of the peach, and then the sense of extenuating time. If you allow for more time, is that going to change the whole quanta aspect of how we register pleasure? Anyway, it's an interesting concept, and I'm sure he had probably other arguments that backed it up, which again we don't have a lot from Epicurus. Not a lot of it survived, and some of the things that we do have are fragments from other people, and sometimes they're not factual because they were arguing against them, and so sometimes he's portrayed in a unfair way by other people, and so you kind of have to be careful about the original arguments. But the two documents that I had you read are considered to be authentic of Epicurus, and so we stick to those and consider those to be fairly good. Um, anyway, so yeah, the main things to remember about Epicurus is that he's not in the Socratic vein at all. He marched by his own drumbeat. He sees the human self as being basically consciousness registering perception as sensation, and that's what we are, just like other animals are. And the best way to live, or the best life for the human being, is to pursue pleasure, which he defines as the absence of pain. Important definition. And that the techniques for that are simply to consider what the overall effect of certain pleasures are. Do they end up leading to more pain in the long run or not? Are they natural and necessary, or are they natural and unnecessary, or unnatural and unnecessary? Um, and to put our life in accordance with those basic principles, he believed would give us the fullest kind of life that we can have. And when our life is over, it's just the absence of sensation. And that's nothing to worry about, according to Epicurus, if you agree to that. And who needs infinite time if you have finite time? So anyway, I'll try to have the new lecture and the new study sheet posted every Monday for each reading that we have. Um, if you have emails, send those in. Go easy on me, as you can see. I had the unfortunate luck of wiping out on the half pipe over spring break. Broke my arm in 2 places, and so it's kind of hard to do everything with my left hand. I am not left-handed, not at all, which I've had to to discover in a very new and intimate way. And so, if I give you short replies to your emails, that's why. It's already been very interesting getting everything set up for this course and so forth with one hand and not my right hand, and and so bear with me on that. But anyway, this is how we'll proceed. I'll post the lecture for every reading and the study sheet that corresponds with it. Keep those presentations coming in. Especially if you haven't done any, keep those in mind and get those done, because those are 35% of your grade. And then get ready for those essay questions that I'll ask you from the study sheets for the final exam. That's pretty much what we have left for about 5 weeks here. It's going to go by really quick. Stay happy, healthy, safe. That's definitely what Epicurus would advise. And and in those moments where Epicurus maybe isn't working for you, go back and read Epictetus, and he'll give you the tranquility and the fortitude to deal with the things that we do not have control over. So hope you're all doing well. Wish I could see you face to face, but in the absence of that, be well, and I'll post the next lecture next week. Take care, guys.